Summer 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the largest military force ever assembled. 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft. The Blitzkrieg that had conquered France, Poland, and most of Western Europe now turned east with unstoppable fury. The invasion began on June 22nd, before dawn, without warning. German artillery opened fire across a 1,000-kilometer front. Bombers filled the sky. Panzer divisions smashed through Soviet defensive lines like they were made of paper. Soviet forces crumbled. Entire armies were surrounded and destroyed within days. Cities that had stood for centuries fell within hours. The Wehrmacht pushed deeper and deeper into Soviet territory, leaving a trail of death and destruction that seemed endless, unstoppable, apocalyptic. The Soviet casualties were staggering beyond comprehension. Hundreds of thousands dead in the first weeks, millions in the first months. Entire generations of young men were being erased from existence. Villages lost every male between 18 and 40. Families received death notices faster than they could bury their dead. The Soviet leadership was in chaos. Stalin had ignored warnings about the invasion. The military was unprepared, poorly led, equipped with outdated weapons and obsolete tactics. Officers who might have organized effective resistance had been purged in the paranoid years before the war. It looked like the end, like the Soviet Union itself would collapse within months, maybe weeks. Like the German war machine would achieve what Napoleon had failed to do: conquer Russia completely. The Soviet casualties were staggering beyond comprehension. Hundreds of thousands dead in the first weeks. Millions in the first months. Entire generations of young men were being erased from existence. Villages lost every male between 18 and 40. Families received death notices faster than they could bury their dead. The Soviet leadership was in chaos. Stalin had ignored warnings about the invasion. The military was unprepared, poorly led, equipped with outdated weapons and obsolete tactics. Officers who might have organized effective resistance had been purged in the paranoid years before the war. It looked like the end. Like the Soviet Union itself would collapse within months, maybe weeks. Like the German war machine would achieve what Napoleon had failed to do: conquer Russia completely. In the chaos, in the desperate scramble to find anyone who could fight, anyone who could slow the German advance, even slightly, the Soviet government made a decision that would shock the world and change the nature of warfare forever. They would allow women to serve in combat roles, not as nurses tending to wounded men in field hospitals, not as support staff typing reports in safe offices far from the front, as pilots, soldiers, warriors who would kill and die alongside men. It was revolutionary. No other nation in the world allowed women in direct combat. The very idea was considered absurd, dangerous, a violation of natural order. Women were supposed to be protected, kept safe at home, shielded from the horrors of war. But the Soviet Union was desperate, and desperation breaks all rules. Marina Raskova, the famous Soviet aviator and national hero, was given permission to form 3 all-female aviation regiments. Women would fly fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance missions. They would engage enemy aircraft in dogfights. They would drop bombs on German positions. They would risk capture, torture, death. The announcement was met with skepticism, mockery, and outright hostility from many quarters. Male pilots said women didn't have the physical strength to handle combat aircraft. Military commanders said women were too emotional, too fragile, would panic under fire. Soviet citizens wondered if this was just propaganda, a publicity stunt designed to boost morale while the real fighting was done by men. But thousands of young women volunteered immediately, flooding recruitment centers with applications. University students abandoning their studies. factory workers leaving their jobs, teachers, engineers, scientists, artists, daughters and sisters of men already fighting, girls as young as 17 who lied about their age to enlist, forging documents and bribing officials. They came from every corner of the Soviet Union, from Moscow and Leningrad, from small villages in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, from industrial cities and remote farms. They came speaking different languages, practicing different religions, carrying different dreams. But they all had one thing in common. They had lost something to the war, and they wanted to fight back. Among them was a young woman named Yevdokia Nosal. She was 22 years old, from a small village called Novorodka in eastern Ukraine. She had studied mathematics at the university in Kharkiv. She was brilliant, her professor said, had a future in research or teaching. She was engaged to be married to a young engineer named Dmitri. They had planned a summer wedding. She had a younger sister, Oksana, who was only 15. Oksana wanted to be a dancer. She practiced every day in their small house, spinning and leaping with such joy and grace that Yevdokia would stop her studying just to watch. Their father was a schoolteacher, a quiet man who loved books and philosophy. Their mother grew vegetables in their garden and made the best borscht in the entire village, or so everyone said. They were a normal family, happy, ordinary, living ordinary lives with ordinary dreams. Then the Germans came. It was late July, 1941. The Wehrmacht had advanced so quickly that many villages had no warning. One day, everything was normal. The next day, German tanks were rolling down the main street. Yevdokia's father tried to hide their food stores in the cellar. The Germans were requisitioning everything, leaving villages to starve. When German soldiers discovered the hidden food, they dragged him into the street. The officer in charge, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, accused Yevdokia's father of sabotage, of resisting the German occupation, of being a partisan sympathizer. Yevdokia's father tried to explain. He was just trying to feed his family. They would starve without that food. Please, he had children. He meant no disrespect to the German army. The officer shot him. Once, in the head, right there in the street, in front of the entire village, in front of Yevdokia and her mother and Oksana. He fell without a sound, just collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. The blood pooled on the dusty street, dark and spreading. Yevdokia's mother screamed, ran to him, held him, but he was already gone. The German soldiers moved on to search other houses, like nothing had happened, like they had just swatted a fly. That night, more soldiers came. They went house to house, looking for food, valuables, anything worth taking. When they came to Yevdokia's house, 3 of them forced their way in. Yevdokia grabbed Oksana and tried to run. They didn't make it. The soldiers caught Oksana, dragged her away, screaming, begging, crying for her sister to help her. Yevdokia fought, clawed at them, screamed. A soldier hit her with the butt of his rifle, and everything went black. When she woke up, it was morning. Her mother sat in the corner, rocking back and forth, not speaking, not seeing, just rocking. Oksana was gone. They never saw her again. Some said the Germans took young girls to labor camps. Others said worse things, things that Yevdokia couldn't let herself think about because the thoughts would drive her insane. Yevdokia's fiancé, Dmitri, joined the army the next day. He was sent to Kiev to help defend the city against the German advance. 3 weeks later, Kiev fell. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the encirclement. Dmitri was among them. Within a month, Yevdokia had lost everything. Her father, murdered. Her sister, taken. Her fiancé, dead. Her home, occupied by the enemy. Her future, erased. Everything that had defined her life, everything she had loved and dreamed about, was gone. destroyed, turned to ash and blood and memories that cut like broken glass. She traveled to Moscow with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burning hatred that consumed everything else. She walked for days, hitched rides on military trucks, slept in ditches, ate whatever she could find or beg or steal. When she arrived in Moscow, thin and exhausted and hollow-eyed, she heard about the all-female aviation regiments being formed. She volunteered immediately. The recruitment officer asked her why she wanted to join, what motivated her. Yevdokia's answer was simple and cold. I want to kill Germans. The officer looked at her for a long moment. That's not enough. We need pilots who can follow orders, work as a team, stay calm under pressure. Yevdokia leaned forward, her voice flat and dead. I will follow any order that results in dead Germans. I will work with anyone who helps me kill Germans. And I will stay calm, because the only thing I feel anymore is hatred. The officer approved her application. She didn't want to support the war effort. She didn't want to defend her country, or serve the motherland, or any of the noble motivations that drove other volunteers. She wanted revenge. Pure, simple, absolute. She wanted to make the Germans feel what she felt. She wanted them to know what it was like to lose everything, to watch your world burn, to have your future ripped away by strangers who saw you as less than human. She wanted them to suffer, and she wanted to be the one who made them suffer. The training was brutal. The instructors were skeptical, sometimes openly hostile. Many of them didn't believe women belonged in combat, didn't believe they had the strength, the courage, the killer instinct needed to survive in the air war. The women faced constant mockery and discrimination. They were given men's uniforms that didn't fit, boots so large they had to stuff them with newspapers, helmets that slipped down over their eyes. The male mechanics refused to maintain their aircraft properly. The male pilots made jokes about them crashing, about them crying, about them running back home to their mothers. The physical training was designed for men. Longer runs, heavier weights, more endurance tests than most of the women had ever experienced. Some couldn't keep up and washed out in the first weeks. Others pushed themselves so hard they collapsed from exhaustion. But those who remained grew harder, stronger, more determined. The women were given the Polikarpov PO-2, the oldest, most obsolete aircraft in the Soviet inventory. Wooden biplanes designed in 1928 as crop dusters and training planes. No armor plating to protect the crew. No defensive guns to fight back. No radio to call for help. No parachutes because the planes flew too low for parachutes to deploy. Maximum speed, barely 150 kilometers per hour, slower than many modern cars. The male pilots called them flying coffins, death traps, antiques that belonged in museums, not combat. They joked that the women would be dead within a week, that this was just propaganda, a publicity stunt that would end in disaster and embarrassment. Yevdokia didn't care about the mockery, didn't care about the inadequate equipment, didn't care about the dangers. She learned to fly that wooden plane with a ferocity that frightened even her instructors. She flew lower than anyone else dared, skimming treetops and rooftops. She flew faster than was safe, pushing the fragile aircraft to its limits. She practiced bombing runs until she could hit targets with terrifying accuracy. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to prove women could fly. She was preparing to die. And she wanted to take as many Germans with her as possible when she went. Her first combat mission was in September 1941. By then, the German advance had slowed but not stopped. They were laying siege to Leningrad, pushing toward Moscow, digging in for what they thought would be the final push to victory. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment received its first operational orders. Their target, A German ammunition depot near the front lines. A simple mission, at least on paper. Fly in under cover of darkness, drop the bombs, fly out before the Germans could react. But nothing about war is simple. Nothing about combat is clean or easy or goes according to plan. Yevdokia was assigned as pilot with a navigator named Katya Ryabova. Katya was 19 years old, from Leningrad. She had been studying astronomy before the war. She was smart, quick-thinking, and absolutely terrified on that first mission. As they took off into the darkness, Katya's hands shook so badly she could barely hold her maps and instruments. Yevdokia, by contrast, felt nothing. No fear, no excitement, just a cold, hollow emptiness. They flew low through the night, following roads and rivers toward the target. The Po-2 rattled and creaked with every gust of wind. The open cockpit exposed them to freezing air that numbed their faces and hands. The engine coughed and sputtered irregularly, threatening to quit at any moment. As they approached the target area, the sky ahead suddenly lit up. Searchlights, massive beams of light that swept back and forth across the darkness, hunting for intruders. The Germans had been expecting them. Then the searchlights found them, locked onto their little wooden plane and held it there, exposed, vulnerable, visible from miles away. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately. The sky filled with tracers, glowing lines of death that streaked past them, above them, below them. Explosions bloomed in the air around them, each one a blast of heat and pressure and metal fragments that could tear their fragile plane to pieces. Katya screamed behind her, not in fear exactly, more like disbelief, like she couldn't believe this was really happening, that they were really here, that they might really die in the next few seconds. Yevdokia's mind went very quiet, very clear. Time seemed to slow down. She saw every tracer, every explosion, every sweep of the searchlights with perfect clarity. This was the moment. This was where she would die, and that was fine, as long as she took some Germans with her. Yevdokia cut the engine. The sudden silence was surreal. The plane glided through the darkness like a shadow, the searchlights sweeping past them, the guns firing where they had been, not where they were. They dropped their bombs. The ammunition depot exploded in a fireball that lit up the entire landscape. Secondary explosions rippled outward as stored munitions cooked off. Yevdokia restarted the engine and climbed away into the safety of darkness. Below, German soldiers scrambled in chaos, their precious supplies burning, their night shattered by an enemy they never saw coming. For the first time since losing her family, Yevdokia felt something other than grief. She felt satisfaction. She felt power. She felt like she had struck back, finally, against the force that had destroyed her life. It felt good, and that terrified her. The Night Witches quickly developed a reputation. They flew multiple missions every night, sometimes 15 or more. They would land, refuel, rearm, and take off again within minutes. No rest, no breaks, just mission after mission after mission. The psychological effect on German troops was devastating. The soldiers couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Every night, they knew the witches were coming. They just didn't know when or where. The sound of wind through canvas wings became a harbinger of death. German soldiers would lie awake in their trenches, listening to the darkness, jumping at every sound, every rustle, every whisper of wind. Some began having breakdowns, refused to stay at the front lines at night, begged for transfers to other units. The Night Witches weren't just bombing German positions. They were breaking German morale. Yevdokia flew night after night, dropping bombs, watching explosions bloom below, listening to the screams of dying men carried on the wind. And with each mission, something inside her hardened. She stopped seeing the Germans as people. They became targets, objects, things to be destroyed. It was easier that way. Safer. Because if she let herself think of them as human, if she let herself imagine their families, their hopes, their fears, she might hesitate. And hesitation in combat meant death. But one night, everything changed. It was a routine mission, or as routine as flying over enemy territory in a wooden plane could be. The target was a supply convoy moving at night along a rural road. Yevdokia and Katya approached silently, engine off, gliding through the darkness. They lined up their bombing run perfectly. Katya had her hand on the release mechanism. Then, in the brief moment when a flare illuminated the target, Yevdokia saw something that made her hesitate. The convoy wasn't military trucks. It was civilian vehicles, wagons, carts, and among them, she saw children, families, refugees trying to escape the war. German refugees, yes, but refugees nonetheless, fleeing the Soviet advance just as Soviet civilians had fled the German advance. For a split second, Yevdokia's hand froze on the controls. She could pull up, abort the mission, let them pass, but the orders were clear: destroy the convoy, and orders in the Soviet military were absolute. Katya released the bombs. The explosions tore through the convoy. Wagons disintegrated. Vehicles flipped and burned. And in the brief light of the flames, Yevdokia saw them, saw the children, saw the mothers clutching their babies, saw the old people who couldn't run fast enough, saw them die. Yevdokia pulled up sharply and flew away, but the images burned into her mind. She couldn't unsee them, couldn't unhear the screams that followed them into the darkness. When they landed, Katya was crying. Yevdokia sat in the cockpit, frozen, unable to move. Their commander came to debrief them, asked if the mission was successful, asked if the target was destroyed. Yevdokia nodded numbly. Mission successful. Target destroyed. But that night, for the first time since beginning combat operations, Yevdokia couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those children, saw their faces in the moment before the bombs hit, saw the terror, the confusion, the innocence. She had wanted revenge, wanted to make the Germans suffer as she had suffered, and she had succeeded. She had delivered death and destruction to German territory, had caused grief and loss to German families, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like she had become the very thing she hated. The force that destroyed innocent lives, the bringer of senseless death. The next day, Yevdokia went to her commander, Yevdokia Bershanskaya. She requested to speak privately. "What is it?" Bershanskaya asked, sensing something was deeply wrong. Yevdokia's voice shook. "Last night, the convoy. There were civilians, children. We killed them." Bershanskaya's face showed no surprise. She had been expecting this conversation. "War," she said quietly, "doesn't discriminate. The bombs we drop don't know the difference between a soldier and a child. That's why war is hell. That's why it should be avoided at all costs." "But we couldn't avoid it," Yevdokia said. "They invaded us." "Yes, and now we're invading them back. We're doing to German territory what they did to ours. Does that make it right? No. Does that make it necessary? Perhaps. Does that make it any less terrible? Never." Bershanskaya sat down, suddenly looking very old, despite being only in her 30s. "Let me tell you something about revenge. It's seductive. It feels righteous. When you've lost everything, when you've been hurt beyond measure, revenge promises to fill that void, to give you purpose, to make the pain mean something." She looked directly at Yevdokia. But revenge doesn't discriminate either. It consumes everything. It turns you into the thing you hate. And when you finally get it, when you finally hurt them as much as they hurt you, you discover something terrible. "What?" Yevdokia whispered. "That it doesn't bring anything back. Your family is still dead. Your home is still destroyed. Your pain is still there. All you've done is spread that pain to others. And now you carry their deaths too. Yevdokia felt tears burning in her eyes. Then what do we do? How do we keep fighting? Bershanskaya's answer was simple and devastating. We fight because we have to. Because if we don't, more people will die. We fight to end the war, not to perpetuate it. We fight to protect what remains, not to destroy what exists. She paused. But we never stop seeing the humanity of those we fight. We never pretend that killing is easy or right or good. We carry the weight of every life we take. That's the price of being human in an inhuman situation. That conversation changed something fundamental in Yevdokia. She kept flying, kept completing missions, but she stopped seeing it as revenge. She saw it as a terrible necessity, a burden she carried because someone had to. She started writing letters to Katya's family, to the families of other pilots who died. She started remembering the names of German soldiers she killed when she could identify them. She stopped celebrating victories and started mourning losses on both sides. Her sister pilots noticed the change. Some thought she was losing her nerve. Others understood. War, they realized, wasn't turning them into monsters. It was revealing how hard it was to remain human. The Night Witches continued their operations throughout the war. They flew over 24,000 combat missions, dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs, became the most decorated female unit in Soviet military history. But the cost was staggering. 30 pilots killed, countless more wounded physically and psychologically. Every survivor carried scars that would never fully heal. Yevdokia survived the war. She flew 354 combat missions, received multiple medals and honors, was celebrated as a hero of the Soviet Union. But when the war ended and she returned to what remained of her village, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a survivor of something no one should have to survive. She rebuilt her life slowly, remarried, had children, became a teacher, just like she had planned before the war destroyed everything. But she never forgot, never stopped carrying the weight of what she had done. The German children in that convoy haunted her dreams for decades. Years later, a journalist asked her what she wanted people to know about the Night Witches, about what they had done, about what they had become. Yevdokia thought for a long time before answering. We were not heroes. We were not villains. We were people put in an impossible situation and forced to make impossible choices. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The Nazis called us Night Witches because we terrified them, because we brought death in the darkness, because we were something they couldn't understand or control. But the truth is simpler and more terrible. We weren't supernatural. We weren't demons. We were human beings who learned to kill, who learned to live with killing, who discovered that the line between victim and perpetrator, between defender and destroyer, is thinner than anyone wants to believe. She looked directly at the journalist. That's what war does. It doesn't turn people into monsters. It forces people to choose between becoming monsters or dying. And sometimes survival means doing monstrous things, the journalist pressed. But you helped stop the Nazis. You helped end the war. Doesn't that justify it? Yevdokia shook her head slowly. Nothing justifies war. War is always a failure of humanity to find better solutions. What we did was necessary, perhaps, but necessary and justified are not the same thing. She leaned back, exhausted. The Night Witches became the terror of Germany. We haunted their nightmares and broke their morale. We helped turn the tide of the war, but we paid for it. With our innocence, with our peace, with the comfortable belief that we would never be capable of taking a life. She looked out the window at the rebuilt village, at children playing in streets that had once run with blood. Every pilot who survived came home changed. Some of us learned to live with it. Others never did. But none of us forgot. None of us could pretend that killing was easy or painless or something we could simply move past. That's the real legacy of the Night Witches. Not the victories, not the medals, not the statistics, but the reminder that war extracts a price from everyone who fights it. That survival is its own kind of burden. That you can do terrible things for good reasons and still carry the weight of those actions for the rest of your life. The journalist had one final question. If you could go back, knowing everything you know now, would you still do it? Would you still become a Night Witch? Yevdokia was quiet for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Yes, because the alternative was surrender, was letting evil go unchallenged, was allowing more innocent people to die without fighting back. But I would do it knowing the cost, knowing that victory doesn't erase the price, knowing that I would carry every death, every bombing run, every scream in the night for the rest of my life. She looked at the journalist with ancient eyes. That's what it means to be human in war. You do what you must. You bear what you must, and you live with it forever. The Night Witches became a legend. Their story was told in books, films, monuments. They were celebrated as heroes who broke gender barriers and helped defeat fascism. And they were all of that. They truly were. But they were also something more complex. They were human beings who discovered that courage and trauma often look the same. That victory and guilt can coexist. That you can be both hero and haunted, both survivor and scarred. They proved that women could fight as fiercely as men. That gender was no barrier to courage or capability. That when pushed to the edge, humans of any gender could find strength they never knew they had. But they also proved something darker. That anyone, given the right circumstances, the right motivations, the right amount of pain, can learn to kill, can learn to live with killing, can become the terror in someone else's nightmare. The most feared female aviators by the Nazis, the night terror of Germany, the ghostly whispers that haunted the Eastern Front. They were not demons. They were not witches. They were not monsters. They were us, human, flawed, capable of extraordinary courage and extraordinary violence, able to love deeply and hate fiercely, strong enough to survive hell and fragile enough to be broken by it. That's the truth the Night Witches teach us, that we're all capable of more than we think, both the good and the terrible, both the heroic and the horrific. And that surviving war doesn't mean escaping it. It means carrying it with you, forever. The weight of what you did, the memory of what you saw, the knowledge of what you're capable of. The Night Witches flew through darkness and brought terror to their enemies. But they never forgot that they too were flying through their own darkness. A darkness that would follow them long after the war ended. Because some nights never truly end. Some ghosts never truly disappear. And some terrors are the ones we carry inside ourselves,